Hi, everybody. Welcome to session 14 of Track G. Sorry for the delay. We had some technical issues, and it's all resolved now. So we have with us Cal Rosen. Here he's a chief data officer of SGI Canada. So over
So
to you, Cal.
I'm not seeing anyone on the any participants. I'm just seeing us three.
So in Zoom.
Yes.
In Zoom, it will be just three of us. So rest of them will be in the streaming platform.
Oh, okay. We just got notes. We're here. Okay, so they can hear us. All right.
Yeah. So and today Cal will be talking about building a successful data program.
All right. We ready to go?
So
Okay. If someone can just text me and let me know that they can see my slides, that would be great. Or Prashant, can you see my slides?
all the best, Cal.
Okay. So we'll get started. Apologies, everybody. We're going to try and get this done within the allocated time. I'll do my best to talk quickly and move through some things very rapidly. Nonetheless, thank you for joining this afternoon. I'm here in Boston, transmitting live, and everyone else seems to be everywhere else, but we'll get this done and accomplished. So I'm going to walk through for the next, I guess, 45 minutes or so of building a successful data program from a blank canvas. Let me just get right into the agenda quickly. I'm going to introduce myself and introduce SGI, an insurance company up in Canada. I'm going to talk about the recipe, and really the recipe in this case is going to precede the ingredients, and there's a reason for that. And as we get through it, you'll see what I mean. Moving on, we're going to talk about the foundation for business, something that I call the data and analytics management framework. I'm also going to share the purpose of why we're doing all of this, and effectively is to become data driven. I'm going to give you some concepts and some introductions to what does it mean to be data driven and how do organizations go about doing it. And then finally, based on my experience, I'm going to provide some lessons learned that share some of the things I've picked up along the way in my 30-year career. Just to give you some background on myself, I've got a degree in electrical engineering. I majored in computer systems design. I've really been focused on data for about 30 years now. I've worked as both a consultant and an executive in a number of industries, probably about 8 or 9 different industries now, working with over 40 clients during the course of my career. Generally, I've worked for anywhere from 6 months to 2 to 3 years with most organizations building their data programs. And what I'm going to show you today is really a methodology or an approach. It's not a be-all end-all, because in some cases, depending on the organization, you've got to pick and choose kind of what you're doing. To give you a range, a sense of the range of my experience, I worked at TD. I was the first ever VP of data governance and data quality there. TD Bank in North America is about 90,000 people across 44 lines of business. And I rolled out the data governance and data quality program across the entire bank. Also had experience in the data office, and I helped stand up the data office at TD. Also helped stand up the data office at Scotiabank, the first formal named data office, their first chief data officer as well. I was supporting that individual and rolled out a lot of the concepts globally for Scotiabank, in addition to being accountable for change management for data across the entire bank, and Scotiabank as well as approximately about 85 to 90,000 people. So some very large organizations I've worked with. I'm going to introduce SGI in just a moment, but from my background, I've spent time leading practices in large consulting organizations, but the most fruitful time has been on my own, which has been about 10 years as an independent contributor, working with organizations. And what I had started to do many years ago was documenting a lot of the things that I had done. And that really helped provide me with a toolkit in many respects, or accelerators that I use liberally and sprinkle them into various engagements that I work on, and including the current engagement that I'm on, which is as the named Chief Data Officer for SGI. So to give you some background as to who SGI is and what we're about, looking at it's two separate sides of the business. On one side, it's a competitive insurance organization writing about 1.1 billion in Canadian indirect premiums. On the other side, and for those of you in the US, you can relate to the DMV title, Auto Fund is really the DMV portion of SGI. And in the province of Saskatchewan, we've got full insurance coverage, no fault insurance when you register a vehicle. So there are gross premiums written there as well. So overall, about 2 billion in gross premiums written. And just so you know, while I do work for the Saskatchewan government, I'm based in Toronto. So now let me get into the recipe. And again, oddly, the recipe is ahead of the ingredients, but let me share. So the first step in approaching any large organization, any new initiative from a data and analytics perspective, is to understand where you are. I often say it's kind of being dropped behind enemy lines and figuring out sort of, okay, where's shelter, where's water, where's food? And this is really going to be critically important to prioritize what needs to be done, but also to point you in the right direction for where things are off the rails the most. And I'll get into this a little bit more in a couple of slides to explain some of the subtleties behind what are the things that you need to be asking. And there's about 150 different measures that are associated with this maturity and gap determination assessment. The second piece then is moving into, now, how do we develop a strategy? And what exactly does that mean? One of the things that I'm concerned about is I've seen a lot of strategies developed that don't fully relate to the business itself. They really talk about data. While there may be business outcomes associated with them, they really get into a lot of tech speak, and it's difficult for that to resonate with the business. So I created something that I call a data management framework, DMF. And really what the DMF is, and I'm going to walk you through components of that, it's really a business document to orient the organization around what exactly we're talking about. Because in my travels, I find that it was very difficult for business people to really understand what's going on from a data perspective. What are you trying to do? What do all these new terms mean? And it didn't really resonate well with the business. And I think that any good data program, really the focus, it's a change management program. It's not about the tech. It's not about the data. It's about change management. We're trying to change behaviors and help organizations leverage this asset that we call data, a ridiculously underutilized asset. And it's really important that we don't forget who the customer is, and the customer is the business. So the easier it is for them to understand what we're talking about, how it all fits, what the different pieces are in business terms, in lay terms, that really, for me, is a key measure of success as you go forward in the program. So then let's look at the first step is doing that gap assessment and understanding where you are. And really what you're trying to answer is what capabilities make up our data program. And that's, as I said earlier, is where the strategy and the management framework come in. The second piece is really to answer the question, how and when will the capabilities be realized? And that's where you come up with your data roadmap. And I'm going to offer you some suggestions about what are the components of a data roadmap. It's really to understand what the priorities are. How quickly do we need to deliver the various components? And this will change based on the organization. And that's why kind of the recipe in this case is, I call it, it's ahead of the ingredients. And then finally, we have to keep score. And that's really around building a strong data policy to understand, are we doing the things that we said we would at the point with which we said we would do them? So a policy is progressive over time. It changes over time. And it really aligns with where you are at any point in time in your journey. I apologize for moving through this really quickly, but based on the time constraints, I want to make sure I get through the majority of the material. So now taking a look at the ingredients. So the landscape itself is really around diagnosing before you prescribe. So there's really 3 questions that you're going to ask across a variety of different dimensions. In total, there are 52 different categories that I've identified. across these 5 main category areas. And really what you're looking for is to understand, as it relates to each of these 52 components, you want to ask 3 questions. And you're going to have 3 visuals that look at how closely or how effective you are in these individual dimensions against the measure we're looking at. So first question is the current state. How good or in place are the components that we're looking for from a current state perspective? So if you're looking at data governance, it breaks down into 4 different components. And you're going to ask the question for every single one of those 52 components. You're going to do a quick current state assessment, and really how good is the current environment in addressing these things. And that gives you your first visual. The second visual is the second question, alignment with leading practices, and then so on to the business impact of the current state. And really what that's helping you to do is build a case for action. So what do we need to do? Where is the area of greatest opportunity relative to each of these dimensions as we proceed? So taking a look first at the strategy itself. And this is what I typically coin. If you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. So it's really important to have a strategy that really answers a number of questions. And I've broken this down into 2 visuals to start with. The components of the strategy themselves. Obviously, we've got an executive summary, and we have an approach that we need to share to say, how are we going to develop the strategy? What are the key components and what's involved in doing the strategy itself? How do we go about doing that? And then finally, why is it required? Why should we do this? Why should we do it now? And these are questions that your business stakeholders are going to be thinking about as you walk through explaining, why do we need to do a data and analytics strategy? The real meat of the strategy comes up by answering who, what, how, and when. And the when obviously is your roadmap. The who is who's involved and who's going to be impacted by these new capabilities, by the execution of this strategy. What capabilities do we need to enable? And this is largely going to be informed by the assessment exercise that you did on the front end. So again, every roadmap has common ingredients, but things change on the order and priority based on where you are, where you're going, and what needs to be accomplished. So that's why I kind of mixed the order of recipe to ingredients. Just to give you some additional background, this methodology has been delivered in large and small organizations, mostly large, and pieces of it in some cases have been deployed as well. So it's really proven in the field, in live environments, and it has proven to be very successful. Jumping now to the data and analytics management framework. And again, this is the book of knowledge for the business. Its sole purpose is to explain to the business what's all this mysticism and you know, I talk further on in the presentation about change management. And how I look at change management is there's a great deal of mysticism and a cloak of secrecy behind data in so many organizations. And business people don't necessarily have a technology background or experience. So they tend to shut off when they don't understand. So our objective here, again, from a change management perspective, is to have them engage, to understand what we're doing, because ultimately they're the benefactor for what we're doing here. It's not about building the sexiest database or consolidating data for no apparent reason. And that's a theme that I've heard in a lot of the sessions I've attended this week. It's really about business outcomes, and I couldn't agree anymore. So really, it's the DMF is the business go-to source for all things data. And I'm going to break down each of these and give you some examples. Just one quick point. So you'll see that I have a data governance organizational model and a data stewardship operating model. That's expressly for the reason when I was at TD, I went on a what I called my whiteboard tour, and I was explaining some of the data governance and data stewardship concepts to various folks across the organization, traveling around North America. And one of the feedback components I got, so just to give you some background, before I took that role, a big consulting firm put forward saying, here's how we're going to do data governance at TD. And so then I was brought in, they said, oh, well, you know, just execute and roll this out across the organization. Again, give you some numbers, the 44 lines of business, which is a fairly daunting number. And what I did was I started talking with both leaders as well as practitioners, asking them what their sense is from the data governance organizational model and what their challenges, they believe the challenges were. And I got a range of answers. The most interesting couple of answers were spoke with the executive vice president for global anti-money laundering, and she said to me, she's a very bright woman, she said to me, you know, I get all this data management talk and I think it's highly worthwhile, but what exactly is it? So she didn't get it. Now, not that she didn't try to, she just didn't understand what everyone was talking about. That was then followed up by a meeting with the CFO of TD Bank in the US. And he said to me, he said, listen, you know, we just got to do some regulatory compliance for Dodd-Frank. We've got to integrate 70 systems into this reporting infrastructure, and they want us to govern this. How exactly are we going to do this? Like, I'm not seeing how that's going to happen based on sort of an organizational structure that's been put forward. And so I went back to my office and I said, I think what we need to do is develop an operating model, explaining at a highly granular level, how do you govern data across a large federated organization where you're providing some degree of consistency in methodology and approach. And I'll share some of that with you shortly. Also, you need to consider other things, such as what is the information consumption and delivery target operating model. So the information consumption perspective is, how are we going to disseminate data and information across the organization? Likely we're adding a new capability, an enhanced perspective in how to do that. And you may want to change some of the ways in which you develop a hub and spoke model, so to speak. I've heard that referred to a number of times this week as well. But you want to make sure you're doing it on a consistent basis. So you don't just give unfettered access to all data to people in all the spokes. There has to be some coordination. There's a line that needs to be developed as to how much control needs to be in place versus how much latitude you give the end user community. From an information delivery perspective, same thing, that's organizing your data office. At SGI, the data office currently consists of about 40 people that have accountability for all data strategy, data enablement, data engineering, as well as analytics and report development across the organization. In addition, we have some spokes out there as well. And over time, I would expect the spoke environments to grow significantly as we mature, as we extend our tentacles, so to speak, into the rest of the organization. So you want to push the information capabilities as far as you possibly can into the lines of business, but at the same time, it's to a specific standard. So I'll give you an example. In a traditional insurance business, you don't necessarily have all of the infrastructure that you would in a digital business, whereas the information is coming in all in real time. It's a really different environment, and you have to really build your environment that lines up with what type of business model and what you're operating with and what you're dealing with. So things change based on organizational dynamics, based on technology stack, based on legacy systems, and all of that has to be taken into account. Not to spend too much time on that, but moving forward, change management and data literacy should be a larger font, as I alluded to earlier, as well as consideration to data sharing agreements and decision rights. When you get into processes, it's really looking at some key components from critical data elements and what exactly they are, why are they important, why does the business need to know about them. Metadata, number one, you need to have metadata infrastructure, metadata repository, and I'll speak to that shortly. In addition, what I've developed over time is, how do you explain metadata to a business person? And I'll offer my interpretation of that as we proceed. In addition, some of the other key components, one of which is data issue management and remediation. So you have to have a standardized manner with which dealing with issues from a data perspective. One other point I wanted to make is, we talk about governance, stewardship, and accountability related to information consumption. My experience was, and I'll give you an example from some of the large banks I've worked with, you've got thousands of people that have typically gone at data themselves, and they've taken the governance responsibility themselves because they have to develop reports, they have to use this data. So what they do in effect is they modify or tune the data sets that they're using, that they're consuming, to the needs of their particular circumstance. And that's problematic, because if you have 1,000 people going at the same data, they're all changing the data a little bit differently, and maintaining a consistent version of truth is impossible. And what I would submit, and I'll get to this in a little bit more time. Let me just hold that one for a moment. I'll come back to it when I break down data governance and data stewardship. But nonetheless, the last piece obviously is technology. You need to have a defined approach that explains in explicit, simple explanation terms, simple terms, what exactly we're talking about, what authoritative sources of data mean and are, how we're going to manage our life cycle, what type of platform needs to be in place. And again, this is a business tool. Looking forward to say, this is from a roadmap perspective. I've typically looked at three separate and obviously continuous work streams. But the first one really is all of the things necessary to put a program and an infrastructure in place. So this is not an exhaustive list, it's representative, but you want to be able to develop the technology and all of the things necessary to realize the program itself. And those are all, in some cases, in most cases rather, overlapping initiatives. So at any point in time, you're going to have anywhere from 15 to 20 initiatives if you follow this type of recipe towards your target state. Looking at data management capabilities, depending on where you are, will determine how big these initiatives need to be and in what order, and as well how many people need to be on them. But really it speaks to standing up the data governance capability, identifying your CDEs, putting data quality in place, getting your business glossary terms vetted and approved. All of the processes necessary to do that across the complex need to be clearly defined, handled as though they are an individual project that aligns to the overall roadmap. And then finally, I call the last work stream reporting and analytics solutions. And really how I define this, obviously you're going to have some key transitional reports that you're going to need to develop. You're going to have to migrate some legacy analysis that you want to put forward. So that becomes part of your development project. But you cannot go off into the wilderness for an extended period of time and lose touch with the business. So what I put in place, or what I try to put in place, are a number of proofs of concept to demonstrate the capabilities to the end user communities. And really how I define this is if someone writes you a check for a whole bunch of money and you're building a new platform, it's effectively, you got to dig a huge hole. So you're putting up this massive apartment building or condo, and you've got to dig a huge hole in the ground because you got to put in 7 floors of parking garage. You've got to put in the foundation, the footing. And after 6 months, they say, okay, we've now spent $3-4 million. What do we have? And they look over the edge and they just see a bunch of dirt turned over. That's not a very compelling case and doesn't breed confidence. In addition, you're also letting your business community get away from you. So what I like to do is put up a design center next to the construction site. And the design center, if any of you shop for a condo lately, the design center effectively emulates what the end state will look like. So when the condo goes up and gets built, what are the units going to look like? So that's what really these proofs of concepts tend to do. And they're focused on high impact capabilities that cannot be achieved today. And they've proven to be massively successful. I've gotten enormous business engagement and buy-in, plus the business gets very excited and it builds expectations. So in effect, you give them a little bit of capability and it draws in even more interest and engagement. And at the end of the day, that's what we're after. We're trying to engage the business in what we're doing. Taking a look at the each initiative that you lay out, you're going to develop what I call a baseball card for each one of these. And this really becomes the starting point for building out your integrated project plan. So now let's look at the data management framework itself. Going to talk about the governance model, so I promise to come back to this. So how I explain this to the business is, in a large organization, I don't want the thousands of people who are consuming data and building reports and analytics to be the ones that are governing data, because they're all going to govern it slightly differently. They're going to include things, exclude things, have different definitions for the same data points. So what I try and say is, effectively what we're doing is we're putting in a retail industry supply chain. And if you ever purchased a product, when you walk into a store, because you buy a product, it doesn't mean that you're assuming the warranty. The warranty is from the manufacturer for how the specifications for that product are developed. What you're assuming when you buy the product is it fit for my purpose? And that's the only decision you should be making. So in a federated model, effectively, what that calls for, in the same way you've got a retail industry supply chain, in the data supply chain, the individuals whose processes are creating that data or originating that data, they're accountable for governing the data. So if they're sharing that data across a number of organizations, and I'll give you an example. So if we have, how I explained it at TD, we had 44 lines of business, and each one of those lines of business was backing onto each other in their backyard. If neighbor 1 is sharing data with neighbor 2, and neighbor 2 determines it's not fit for their purpose, there was an ongoing argument between neighbor 1 and 2 that you have to fix this data, and nobody wanted to pay for the repair. When you're now exposing that across the organization, neighbor one shares that data with neighbor two, but because you're on the same number of same councils and you're seeing all these things, neighbors 7, 8, and 9 are also consuming the same data. So therefore, the problem is not just with neighbors 1 and 2, it's neighbor 1 to neighbor 2, number 7, neighbor 8, and neighbor 9. And that then gets exposed at the council levels for where are the priorities of what we need to do to take remedial action to repair data that is being consumed across the organization that's highly important. So it's really looking at a different level and the understanding the operational model and making that work. Again, the best example I've seen is to use it as a retail industry model. I talked briefly about the information consumption and delivery target operating model, but the most effective models that I've seen is the data office sits between IT and the business, closer to the business, less so in IT. In addition, some of the capabilities from a data engineering perspective, data platform architecture, reside within the data office because you need to be nimble. You can't put in requests and say it's going to take us 6 months and $1 million to add a data element to the environment. So you need to focus on being nimble, being quick, turning around requests in a rapid manner, and that only happens when you have control of the assets necessary to make it happen. And then finally, I talked about change management and data literacy. There are a number of components to doing that. On the upper left corner here, data literacy, you need to have a number of training initiatives that are targeted to the audience at hand. The first one's an onboarding initiative. You need to have data training, so you need to train people in self-serve. How do you access the data? What exactly do you do? How do you go about? How is it organized? How is it structured? So they need to become very intimately aware of how the data is structured for them to execute what they need to execute. Then there's the tools training, and the last one is data storytelling. So people don't necessarily come out of the box knowing how to tell a story with data. They need to be shown how, and this is a new and emerging capability. And I think that the industry in general has come a long way in doing this. There are also other tools without getting into the details. And I mentioned my first bullet here is necessary. It's necessary to remove the mysticism and cloak of secrecy around data. The business needs to be comfortable with all of these things. But what I've put in place in a number of organizations are drop-in cafes and cooking with the pros. So a drop-in cafe, for those of you that are fans of the Peanuts cartoon that are familiar with Peanuts, Lucy Van Pelt used to be in her little booth with a jar or a can and said 5 cents for advice. That's exactly what the drop-in cafe is. It gives the opportunity to chat with the experts, to ask the question where they don't necessarily need to put in a ticket to get it resolved or answered. They just have a simple question. And it's likely others have a similar question as well. So it allows you then to track what are people asking, how are they interacting with us, do they understand the things that they need to understand in order for us to be as effective as possible. Looking at cooking with the pros, that's really a showcase opportunity. And you're going to bring in the business to present. So if they've developed some self-serve, self-authored report or infrastructure or analytics rather, it gives people the chance to show their peers, here's some of the great things that we've done, leveraging the data, leveraging the capability, and it tends to breed some great thinking as far as collectively across the organization. Moving forward now to the data management processes, and I apologize, I'm moving through this pretty quickly, but we have some limited time. So CDE is really is focusing on the aspects that, there's lots of data out there, but not all of it is truly critical. And what this makes sure is that the degree of data management rigor that we're applying to data is focused only on the data that's most important. So it really is a way of scoping some of this work that you're going to be doing over time. Metadata, one of the great ways in which I've explained metadata in the past is that if you think about every single data element is a container on a ship. And as this ship is proceeding and you want to discover, if you go onto the ship and you open up one of the containers and you look inside and you concisely describe the contents that you see, that's effectively business metadata. So you're describing the contents of the container. Then you get off the ladder and now you go take a tape measure and you measure the width, the height, the depth of the container, and effectively that's technical metadata. So the container itself is the technical metadata. the contents are the metadata. And in some cases, the contents can be deceiving, and that's where you get to data quality, but that's a whole other discussion. Then as that ship docks at port and you move the containers off of the ship onto another conveyance, you're capturing operational metadata. So that explanation is one that I've used a number of times with business people, and it resonates well, and they tend to understand what that's referring to. Moving over to data quality, you could probably do an hour-long discussion on data quality, but really you need to figure out is how much rigor are we going to apply with respect to the number of dimensions that we're going to identify for data quality in our organization. It depends who you talk with. There's anywhere from 6 to 12. And you know, it doesn't work for everybody to have 12, and in some cases 6 may not be enough, depending on how much of a purist you are. But it's important to note that when you're talking data quality, this is around the profiling of your authoritative sources of data. Data quality for a data scientist means something completely different. But what's interesting is I found a quote from Andrew Ng. What I thought was interesting is he's done a lot of work, obviously, in analytics, and he says the model and the code for many applications are basically a solved problem. Data is the key. It really consists of understanding that data and how well it's defined, how clear it's defined, and the detail and levels of quality that we're applying to data. So data quality and metadata are the keys to making data management processes work and effective. From a platform architecture perspective, a lot depends on where you've been, where you are, where you're headed. So don't take this illustration as any guide of any kind. It's just a sample representation. There are all sorts of forms of architectures available today. And depending on where you've been and where you're headed, my biggest recommendation for organizations is simplicity. Do it as simple as possible. One that can be sustained based on the nature of the organization that you work at. And that depends on the size of the organization, the legacy, the competency in new technologies. There's a whole bunch of factors that need to be considered with respect to picking your platform architecture. Looking at advanced analytics, obviously there's offensive and defensive strategies. Most organizations were born out of defensive strategies, managing risk, managing cost. The offensive strategies are focused on revenue generation, revenue retention, revenue growth and extension, and focus mostly on customer-oriented activities. And really, I look at you need to create a strategy around advanced analytics that focuses on the analytical areas of focus. Are we focusing on client experience, governance, regulatory, and compliance? Are we focused on operations? Do we need to optimize our operations? And then that's also on the other axis is 3 key components: is optimization. That's do we need to deliver efficiently and effectively against that dimension? Extending, do we need to foretell what's next for customers and employees? And then finally, emerging. We're going to anticipate what is to be and where it is to be. So it's really applying those 3 bullet points against client experience, GRC, and operations at large to determine what your pattern looks like for offensive and defensive strategies. And then finally, search, visualization, and reporting. I'm going to talk a little bit more shortly about how do you have an organization become data-driven. But in a sense, this is the data management framework that is used to, again, to summarize, to explain to the business what are the components of our data program, what is it that we're doing, and how is it going to benefit you as the business. So typically there's a bunch of onboarding material around this to acclimate people to the data program. In addition, there's a published document that speaks to each of these components, what it is, why is it needed, what's the benefit to the business, and then finally details with respect to that individual component so that they have a reference or a guidebook to go back to understand what all these components are and how they fit together. So now to the key point of the whole discussion. How do you become data-driven? And this is something I've thought of a great deal through the years, and I've landed on there's a number of things that you could consider, but I'm focusing on 3 especially. And one is we need to engage with the business in more appropriate manners than we do today. And what I advocate for is a business insights team I've heard them referred to in a number of ways in a few sessions this week. But effectively, these are folks who are in the data office, but they sit in the business and they work with the business expressly to bring ideas forward, to understand the gap between the business itself, or to bridge the gap, not understand it, to bridge the gap between the business itself and the actual content and data and analytics that can be brought forward to empower the business. And these are really, you'll know they're successful. And someone, I can't take credit for this, but someone else I know has coined a phrase that if they're invited to the business's Christmas party, you know you've been successful. And that's pretty much the objective for this group. The second piece is aligning with the annual business planning and execution process. So really it's about prototyping and understanding what are the company objectives and how do we create value. And I have another slide that drills down into that a little bit more. And the third piece is how do we help the company run better every single day? So it's numbers 2 and 3 are execution capability around short-term or mid-term annual business planning and longer-term business process and job functions. How do we impact the actual job function with capability beyond that which we have today? And it's really getting into the detailed business processes and job functions that are out there. So let me talk about number 1 first. So I did talk briefly in the intro, but really the purpose is to stimulate, extend, and sustain demand. And the key there is to stimulate. So if you leave them to their own devices, the business will go off and you'll have different execution perspectives, different priorities in every line of business you're working with. And what you want to do is streamline that, because you want to have a semblance of how do we go about this? What's the consistent way in which we engage? It helps businesses understand what the purpose of the data office is and what they can expect overall from your contribution and participation. Looking at numbers 2 and 3, what I always like to focus on is we need to get more ingrained in what the business planning cycle is. What are the business objectives? And you want to decompose every single business objective and understand what data, information, insights, analytics, or advanced analytics need to be applied to help to achieve each business objective. And then you decompose each business objective into its corresponding strategies, tactics, and outcomes, and you ask the exact same question. So what you're looking at, in effect, is hundreds of components of analytics or analyses that you need to conduct to help inform what it is we need to do right now. What are we trying to accomplish as an organization? And that really speaks to how nimble are we to get the right information to what we're trying to achieve at the right time. And it will involve a lot of prototyping and prioritization, because you need to be nimble. You need to be fast to bring these forward. And guess what? Next year, it's a whole new set required. So that's where the nimbleness needs to come in. And that's why you can't go off and take 6 months to build these reports. It's really got to be done in an agile, rapid return manner, and make sure that any gaps in your data set are easily and rapidly accommodated. Looking to number 3 on the right, it's really around decomposing the actual business processes themselves and understanding if we were to transform this business process and make it more intelligent. It could be that we need to develop a workbench. And in our case, we're talking about building workbenches for both the adjusters as well as the underwriters. And that really starts with understanding and decomposing what is the job function itself. Where are we headed from a transformation perspective for the organization? What does our product canvas look like for each of these individual use cases? And that then tells us, we put that into the mix to say, what is the prioritization for what we need to build to make that process or role more data centric as we proceed. And then finally, I'm going to share some lessons learned. As I said earlier, I've been doing this for about 30 years now, worked in many, many organizations across numerous industries. And these are some of the things I picked up along the way. So when you're starting one of these programs, you need to clearly articulate what each of the program phases will look like when you're done. That way that people don't just sit back and have some vague sense of where we're headed, but they have a true idea of where you're going and understand what their stake in it is as well. The second piece, as I mentioned earlier, you need to maintain close line of sight with the business. So you don't go off and start to build whatever it is you're building. You need to stay in touch with the business. You need to stay in front of the business, bring them on a rapid and frequent basis into this design center so that they take ownership of some of the build and some of the capability as you proceed. Also, we're going to design and build the data structure, be it a data fabric or a data mesh or a decentralized, like it depends on, again, the organization, where you've come from, where you need to be. But it's the most important, at least for our perspective in the insurance business, we need a single version of truth. You can't have people walking into the CEO's office with different numbers on earned premium. It's a single calculation across the organization. And no matter who slices it, you're going to get the same answer. And that's really critical, especially in the financial industry and the insurance industry. So the idea where end users have full sort of latitude to pull data from everywhere, and what I call integration at the desktop, that doesn't work in my travels in the financial industry and the insurance industry. It may work in more digitally based organizations or industries. Need to emphasize data management processes and practices. It's critical that if you're doing this in the long term, and it's about sustainment, so it's not building these things as a one-time, it's how are we going to sustain it? How are we going to extend what we built? How are we going to grow? How are we going to support it? All these questions need to be understood and explained up front. And that way that the appropriate degree of attention is applied to some of these capabilities. Over deliver on change management. That is one of the more critical components from a change perspective. It really will determine your overall success and effectiveness. And if there's anything you can't afford to miss, and this is reinforced by some of the sessions I've attended this week, is change management. And then finally, from my humble opinion, adoption is the only true measure of success. That if all of this effort that you're applying and everything you're building is not geared towards adoption and perhaps sustainment on an ongoing basis, then you have missed the mark somewhere. So that should be the focus, getting the organization to come along with you, to join the journey, a shared journey, and that then is the recipe for success for making data programs effective and making it work. And with that, I got in under the hour, under the wire. I thank you for your attention. I hope it wasn't too quick for you, but had to move through it based on some technical difficulties we had at the start. Happy to take any questions if anyone has them at this point. Prashant, are you still with us?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Hi, Cal. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. Were very inspiring, and you covered a lot, though we were late by about 10 minutes, but it was, you covered a lot, and you were able to finish before time. So there are a couple of questions here. The first one is from Stefan, who is asking us or you, what's the difference between an organizational model and the operating model? I have seen these two terms used interchangeably. Do you want to take it, Cal?
Sure. So thank you for the question. That's a great question. So an organizational model really describes the reporting structure of individuals, who has accountability at various levels, what the council organizational structures are, what their decision authority is, and speaks to the roles and responsibilities. So in a nutshell, the organizational model starts with the roles and responsibilities of individuals such as data stewards and other people who are participating in the process. The data office, we've got data governance specialists or liaisons who work with the business. It describes their function. So really it's talking about what you're accountable for, what your roles and responsibilities are. The operating model speaks to how does this work on a daily basis. So if you think about, I'm just thinking off the top of my head here, it may not be the best analogy, but it's attuned to looking at a vehicle. The vehicle specifications are what they are. So you've got a steering wheel, you've got an engine, you've got your tires, but how you drive it is an entirely different matter. And so in this case, how the operating model works is, again, I come back to the retail industry supply chain, has nothing to do with the roles and responsibilities because they're applied against different components of that data supply chain. But what you're specifying in the operating model is how do we govern data as an organization? Who has the accountability for governing data in which line of business? And how does that relate to other people who are governing data across the organization? So what that works to be in a large organization, there are federated accountabilities resulting in primary and secondary stewardships that need to be determined about who has the ultimate decision authority, who owns data issues and accountability. So it's really speaking to how do we function from a governance perspective versus who's accountable and what are their responsibilities. I hope that helped answer that question.
Excellent. There's one more question from Veronica. Her question is, in your experience, how have your approaches differed or even stayed same when servicing government organizations versus private sector businesses? What strategies or ideas are best for one versus the other?
Well, again, thank you for that question. That is a great question because during the course of my career, I've spent a lot of time in the public sector. I've spent more time, obviously, in the private sector, probably on a 3-to-1 ratio for private to public. So the first thing I can tell you is, and that's why I go back to putting the recipe before the ingredients. The recipe is the same for all organizations, at least in my humble opinion, in my travels. What changes is the priority and the drivers of what needs to be done. So that first current state assessment really tells you where you are and what has to change or be upgraded in order for the organization to achieve what it expects to achieve from a data and analytics intensification. So I haven't seen a pattern between public and private sector in many respects, but every organization has slightly different priorities of where they want to be and what they expect out of a data and analytics initiative or program. And they're all starting in different places. What I've found in a lot of government organizations, it takes longer to get things decided. It's slower to move. That's not necessarily the case at SGI because we are a government organization, but we are a competitive insurer, and we do have sort of a cross between our foot and sort of both camps. So we need to be nimble, and the work we're doing right now is part of an overall transformation initiative. So it's accepted and understood that we need to move in a more nimble manner. But in general sort of circumstance, it's much harder to move the needle when it comes to government industries. Or the government industry in general. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it was good. There's last one from me, though I didn't put it there in the platform. So you mentioned about adoption and change management, which was fantastic. So do you have any specific measures to or KPIs to look at how the adoption of all your initiatives are going, Cal?
Yeah, that's also a very good question. Thank you, Prashant. The individual training, data literacy itself, I heard earlier from, I believe it was the CDO at Colgate-Palmolive. She had a great approach where she tested the individual's current state. Like, you know, in any training program, it's important to understand what people bring at the start, what they learn through the training program, and then 3 to 6 months later, what they retained and what they're actually doing with respect to what they were trained to do. And so what you want to do is measure, say, okay, this is these individuals, where they are right now. This is how they were impacted or what they took away from the training they received. And do they need remedial training at a 3-month time frame, or how much did they retain? Are they actually using what they were trained to do? So you've got to constantly revisit and understand whether or not they're effectively adopting what the new tools and capabilities that they have, or if remedial action is required. Because again, I come back to my last point, adoption is the measure of success. And you need to measure the effectiveness and currency of your data literacy program in order to get there.
Okay, excellent. Excellent, Cal. Thank you very much, sir, for your time. It was very insightful. I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation, and all the best.
Thank you very much, and I hope everybody found it worthwhile. I'm here at the Hyatt, so if you want to track me down this evening, I'll be around on the main floor, and we'll see you soon.
Okay, see ya. Bye-bye.
Thank you.